Welcome back, everybody, to another reaction video, and today we're going to go back to Alternate History Hub, and we're going to look at a video about what if the American Civil War never happened. Now, I haven't seen this video yet, so I don't know what they're going to cover, but I'm pretty excited to dive in and see what they have to say. While I'm thinking about it, make sure that your notifications are turned on. If you haven't already subscribed, do that first. But once you subscribe, turn on all notifications. That way you're aware whenever there's anything new that comes up. Today at 5 p.m. Eastern Time is going to be the premiere of my latest original content, which was my visit a couple of weeks ago to Hollywood Cemetery in Richmond, Virginia. It's a burial place of 2 American presidents, as well as Confederate President Jefferson Davis, 28 Confederate generals, over 18,000 enlisted Confederate soldiers who died during the American Civil War, including most of the dead from Gettysburg. So you'll see some of those highlights. It's about a 20-minute video, and it'll be a premiere so we can all kind of live chat while we're watching it together. But turn on your notifications so you don't miss that. More original content is coming in the coming days, including tomorrow, maybe Saturday, actually. Well, now that I think about it, my son's got a soccer tournament on Saturday. Maybe Sunday. Sometime in the next few days, we're going to do a live stream where I'm going to show you some tips on how to research your family history. So let's go ahead and dive into what if the American Civil War never happened.
The road to the Civil War was one long chain of compromises and attempts to keep an unstable balance from toppling over. It's almost insane to imagine the history of the United States going any other way than the Civil War. Slave power and the influence the aristocratic plantations had on Southern politics made secession to protect itself inevitable.
And you know, it's absolutely true. In fact, the compromises go all the way back to the formation of the country itself, at least the formation of the Constitution. There were compromises that had to be made even then, and actually even going back to the Declaration of Independence, there were compromises made with the wording of the Declaration of Independence to make it palatable to the southern states, because they needed to get everybody on board with it. And with the Constitution, they had to reach these compromises that kind of acceded to the demands of southern slave states. So the very beginnings, the foundation of the United States was built on this compromise between North and South, and it was something that could not last forever.
What if in an alternate timeline, one change shaped early America in such a way that slavery doesn't become a behemoth in the South, and so it never secedes to protect it?
So I don't know where he's going with this, but my initial thought is there are 2 things that could have happened. Number one, Eli Whitney never invents the cotton gin. If that happens, slavery never becomes, like he said, the behemoth that it becomes. And it probably dies a natural death. The other thing is, when they passed the Constitution, they did build into the Constitution that in 20 years' time, they could abolish the slave trade, which, like in the British Empire, was something that would come first. In the British Empire, they abolished the slave trade in the first decade of the 1800s, and it was another 25, 30 years before they actually abolished slavery itself. They could have built something in like that where slavery would slowly be phased out in some way.
And yes, the South seceded to protect slavery. They even say so. Here, and here, and here, and anywhere else. Just research it yourself. So what if the Civil War never happened? I know it sounds crazy. How does one change lead to the South never seceding? Well, it's not one change, it's one invention.
100% agree.
Cotton was the oil in the antebellum South, but it wasn't always like that. During colonial times, cotton was easy to grow, but it was difficult to harvest. Farm hands or slaves would need to pluck each seed of cotton from the stalk. That seed is what is used for clothes and textiles. Even with slave labor, not much cotton could be harvested to be profitable, and so it just wasn't worth it to plant. Instead, tobacco was farmed as the ideal cash crop. But by the turn of the 18th century, tobacco stopped being as good of an investment also, and with that, slaves. The reason why the Founding Fathers appeared to just kick the issue of slavery down the road wasn't just because they needed to keep the colonies united, or even because some owned slaves, but because it was a common conception at the time that slavery was on its way out, peacefully being discontinued for more profitable solutions. By the 1790s, the US outlawed the import of slaves and started cracking down on ships in the Atlantic, which did so. But this all changed in 1793 with the cotton gin. The cotton gin was invented to make the time-consuming process of picking individual cotton pieces obsolete. Now more seeds could be harvested and more cotton could be produced at an industrial scale. Long story short, this single invention vastly multiplied the production of cotton and made it a fantastic investment.
100% agree, and as I said at the top of this, that changes the trajectory of slavery. And, you know, he makes an interesting point, and that's not something I had really considered a whole lot, was that pre-cotton gin, the founding fathers probably did have the understanding that slavery was probably a dying institution, and so maybe in kicking the can down the road, they didn't think they were kicking the can down the road quite so far, and they thought that it would eventually work itself out. You know, I hadn't thought of it that way before, but that's certainly a possibility.
Colonists expanded west as fast as they could, buying up much of the land to plant as much cotton as possible. Plantations grew, and the southern Mississippi River became the best property in the South. We can even see the effects of this in the demographics of the region today. By the early 19th century, the South was the largest producer of cotton in the world, selling it to Britain, Europe, and especially the North, who replaced their wool for cotton to make into textiles and clothing.
So yeah, excellent point there, because the North is benefiting from slave labor. Because the textile mills in the North, where are they getting their cotton from? From slave plantations in the South. So they're getting that cotton cheaper than they otherwise would if it weren't for slavery.
And with new money, there came a new power. A class of southern plantation owners who now had such vast amounts of wealth they could influence the government, the culture, and even the laws to protect their economic system. The South became ruled by an aristocracy, in a way. The institution that was on its way out was now a permanent system in the South, and losing that system was now never going to happen peacefully. In this alternate timeline, the cotton gin, or anything like it, simply isn't invented. That's it. The reason I'm choosing this as the divergence is simply, well, what other option is there? If the South mass-produced cotton in any way, then slave politics continue surviving.
I think he makes an excellent point, and I would say that is probably the simplest solution, the simplest change by which we don't get an American Civil War, and I agree. I don't see any other way it doesn't happen without some kind of compromise that you would get the South to agree to about phasing it out slowly. But again, I don't know that they would ever have agreed to something like that.
There is no piece of legislation that simply ends the practice peacefully as long as it's profitable. And really, neither side wanted to. Balance was the solution, not ending it, at least for most people. I'll talk about this later. We'll begin this alternate timeline somewhere in the 1820s and 30s. Without cotton becoming the gold mine for the South like in our timeline, it'd be harder and harder for plantations to financially justify the use of slave labor. That money not being used to pay labor was still being used to house and feed them. Cotton was so lucrative that the richest owners could afford to house vast numbers of slaves, but tobacco couldn't provide an income to do so on such a massive scale. It might be over a period of decades, but the practice of slavery slowly dies out naturally simply because it's too costly.
Yeah, and he's 100% right about tobacco. My great-great-grandparents were tobacco farmers in Kentucky. They had 11 sons to work their tobacco farm, and they were still dirt poor. So, I mean, 11 sons is about as close as you get to having slave labor without having slave labor. And they could not scratch together more than just the bare minimum of a living. So, yeah, tobacco was just not lucrative in the way that cotton was.
It's probably replaced by a similar system we saw in the Reconstructed South, where freed slaves came back to the fields they worked, but this time with a minimum amount of payment. This certainly isn't a happy scenario where everyone gets along or even can feed their family, but the economic behemoth of slavery is killed before it really divides the nation, and also people aren't being enslaved anymore. While the inevitable expansion of the US to the West doesn't change, manifest destiny and all, what might change is the inclusion of new states themselves. For 4 decades leading up to the Civil War, this balance between free and slave states dominated the creation of states.
That's true.
The struggle between slave and free over who would control seats in Congress. The Missouri Compromise established a border between these two factions, with any state below the 3630 parallel allowing slavery and above it free, excluding Missouri. Since Missouri was brought into the Union as a slave state, Maine was then created to equal things out. Perfectly balanced. Oh, you knew I was gonna make that joke. In this alternate scenario, there is no need for Maine to exist as a state. Instead, it remains a part of Massachusetts. Now, as for Texas, alternate Texas, after its independence, is annexed immediately by the United States following its revolution, instead of remaining a nation for a decade. The reason why Texas was a nation for so long wasn't just because the US didn't want a war with Mexico, but it was because Texas was a slave state.
Yep.
Northerners didn't want another slave state added without a new free state of their own.
And so until there was an option for another free state to add, and there just wasn't another option yet because Iowa, Minnesota, places like that, Kansas, they just didn't have enough population yet to be able to admit them as states. And so, yeah, that's why Texas kind of sits there for, 9-10 years before it's finally admitted. And when it is admitted, it kicks off the Mexican War. So I wonder if that might have kicked off a war with Mexico even sooner.
And that didn't come to be until the 1840s. Then once Texas was included, it remained the massively large state we know and love today. The funny thing was, though, the rest of America thought Texas would have been too big as a state and wanted to break it up into 5 separate ones. However, this would have ruined the balance, so Texas kept its gigantic size. In this scenario, without the balance needed, Texas might have actually just been split into 5 separate states. Yeah. You can imagine how that's divided up in any way. Ironically, the Lone Star State might have just become multiple stars on the American flag. The old border is seen as a thing of the distant past, like the Northwest Territory. If this did happen earlier, the Mexican-American War would occur a decade earlier than in our timeline, as Mexico still would see Texas as its territory. Borders are fun and all, but the biggest change that happens is inside the United States. A change that fundamentally alters the economic and social core of the 19th century US. It's often said that the North was able to industrialize while the South relied on cotton, but the thing was the North was only able to industrialize so quickly because of Southern cotton. The North's main industry was...
You know, we don't think about that much. When we think about the elimination of slavery, you think primarily about how it affects the South. But as we talked about a little while ago, northern textile mills rely heavily on slave-produced cotton from the South. And so now that cost goes up because it's got to be imported from somewhere else if the South isn't producing it. Or maybe you just don't get textile mills growing at the rate that they do. Interesting. I hadn't thought about that. That's pretty smart.
Was textiles. In fact, for the first half of the 1800s, textiles and other cotton-related industries were almost 50% of the US economy. Both North and South relied heavily on slave-picked cotton, just for different reasons. Without this cheap amount of resources to make clothing out of, the North would need to stick to what they've always used: wool, which is far more expensive to produce, gotta feed those sheep, and there'd be less wool available than cotton. This goes for Britain and Europe too, by the way, but we'll talk about those ramifications later. Without mass cotton plantations, the entire United States has a far smaller economy, but while the North would understandably be smaller without cheap textiles, the South practically doesn't have one in a world without the cotton gin. In our timeline, by the time of the war, the North had 17 million people, and the South had 13 million, but 4 million of those were slaves. Without slavery being practical, the population of slaves is dramatically smaller in an alternate timeline.
I want to take a look at those numbers, because I guess it depends on how he's dividing the North and the South. He might be including states like Kentucky, Maryland, Missouri as part of the South. Because I don't know how those numbers add up otherwise. I thought it was more like 9 million in the South with 4 million included slaves. Let's take a look. Yeah, so the population of the states that joined the Confederacy is 9.1 million in the 1861 census, and included in that is 3.5 million slaves. So that was a little bit off of what he said there. So he may be including the border states in that population total. I don't know how that would get the number, but I think the Union population then is still somewhere around 18 million. Okay, here we go. 23 states with a population of 22 million. So that's the difference. There's the 4 million that he's added to the south rather than to the north, and that's probably those border states. So, okay, I get that.
After the cotton gin was invented, the slave population quadrupled in size, meaning that the South might have 5 million less people than the North. States like Mississippi, Alabama, and Arkansas were settled mainly due to their soil. This alternate South is far less populated, poorer economically since it doesn't sell cotton to the North, and with that, more isolated from the North as well. Which brings up an interesting perspective. Even in a world without the cotton gin and the eventual decline of slavery willingly by the South, there still would be a divide culturally between North and South, simply because of geography and population. The Great Lakes and bountiful rivers allowed for transportation and expansion into places like Ohio and Illinois decades before the South could do the same, considering they had to trek through humid forests. Their waterways didn't go east to west like the Ohio or the Great Lakes, they go north to south. Long story short, the South would really just be separated from the rest of the nation, divided from the North by climate, geography, and economics to form its own culture as well, simply because of the cards that the settlers were dealt with. So what about the destiny of the now freed slaves themselves? At the time of the American Revolution, slaves made up 20% of the total population. Assuming that the institution doesn't increase after the 1790s, the black population of America doesn't explode like it did in the days of the antebellum South. So while the population probably grows, it doesn't as rapidly as in our timeline. Since the South would still be agrarian, they'd be paid cheap wages to work in the fields, much like it was after the Civil War.
So after the Civil War, what ends up happening is that under Reconstruction, and especially after Reconstruction goes away, the South starts passing all of these laws that basically reinstitute slavery in all but name. They require a lot of these workers, a lot of these former slaves end up going back to the plantations that they worked on as labor, as cheap labor, and they're forced to sign these contracts that basically make them slaves. They can't get out of the contracts. They're basically working for room and board. So they're slaves in all but name, because there was no, the government really didn't do anything to provide for them and to get them up on their feet. So they really had nowhere else to go.
Racial policies probably wouldn't allow blacks to own much land, and they'd still be second-class citizens. Yeah. The difference here is, even though they're not enslaved, the political rights of blacks in America are pretty much ignored north and south. Slavery was much a dividing and driving issue that once it became a part of this great national conflict, then the treatment of blacks afterward were paid attention to by the North. But without slavery, or more importantly to the North, the political power of slavery, then the North simply doesn't care to put the time and effort into protecting the well-being of freed blacks in this remote part of the nation. That means laws such as the 14th and 15th Amendments created post-war would never have the political backing or need to be implemented so early.
Yeah, so early, and that's true. And he's right about that, because the 13th Amendment gets passed that frees slavery, it ends slavery. I think the law says, except as a punishment for crime in which that person has been duly convicted. But the 14th and 15th Amendments were much more reactionary to what was going on in the South. One of the reasons there was so much support for the 14th and 15th Amendments, which basically made at least black men equal in terms of giving them citizenship, the right to vote, things like that. The reason those got pushed through as quickly as they did is that there was a lot of groundswell of support for those things because of how badly former slaves were being treated in the South. And that kind of created that in the North. You don't get that popular support for that without the events happening in Reconstruction. So, I agree with him. This is really well thought out. And this is obviously somebody who knows what he's talking about and understands everything that was going on really well.
Blacks might not have true rights for decades further in this alternate timeline. This is the 19th century, where the fundamental idea was that whites and blacks were too far different to be in one considered nation.
True.
Their treatment and conditions would be pretty similar to the Chinese in California. The conditions and injustices done upon them, not really a concern for the rest of the country. Would this change in the 20th century? Perhaps. However, without that emotional attachment from the Civil War, civil rights is far harder to achieve or gain a national platform.
That's a good point about the emotional attachment. When you have lost hundreds of thousands of young men on the battlefields, there is much more of an investment in wanting to make that mean something, wanting to make their blood, their sacrifice, not be in vain. And to be able to say that they died to set other men free and to give them rights was important. And he's right. Without the emotional attachment of the blood that was shed to make that happen, there's not the investment by as many people.
Along with other reasons that I'm going to get to later. So continuing on, it is an alternate 1861. By this time, Abe Lincoln never becomes president for many reasons. The most important is Lincoln only really won because at the time of his election, the race was split between 4 different candidates, and also half of the country refused to have him on the ballot. And without the institution of slavery, I doubt such a mess of a race would happen and allow Lincoln to win, if he ever ran at all. By now, 4 decades without slave power, the line of politicians and presidents would be so dramatically changed that I can't even predict it.
Yeah.
I doubt Buchanan would have even gone to office. You probably heard the common saying that before the Civil War, Americans saw themselves more as Ohioans or Virginians or New Yorkers than a part of any bigger nation. And overall, that was true. They saw themselves as a part of their states that were simply united. How united they were was only tested by the Civil War. And in the end, that unity was not simply a bunch of states together, but one single nation. Without that test of a war between the states, those states might continue on seeing themselves as more independent
I'm an Ohioan.
from not just the federal government, but from one another. That's one of the main things now missing from this alternate world. The Revolution was the creation of the country, but the Civil War was almost a rebirth. A baptism by fire that defined how this new U.S. would be in the next century.
And that's why Lincoln says in the Gettysburg Address, a new birth of freedom. And he's absolutely right. And I think they mentioned this in the sequel to National Treasure, where he talks about that after the Civil War, people started saying the United States is instead of the United States are. They always referred to the United States plurally before then, but after that we referred to as one united nation. And it's not quite that simple, but that gives you an idea of the change in mindset that takes place.
The ideas that the American civilization was the shining city on a hill and an experiment for God and democracy was something that became finalized in the Union cause. For the South, they had their own religious and moral reasons for rebelling, but the way the Union viewed the war to keep that experiment of United Republic alive continued on and evolved afterwards to redefine how America would see itself on the global stage. And it wasn't just that mindset that was created from the war. The war invited the federal government to have broader oversight, such as creating a new national currency, and perhaps unconstitutional laws on criticism of the government during wartime. None of those might exist in such an alternate timeline. As America ages without this centralized government birthed from war, Americans see themselves as a part of an alliance more than an actual country. As the rise of the modern nation-state takes place across the world in places like Germany and Italy, perhaps the US might attempt to centralize federal power. However, that'd be a massive debate, just as it is now. This type of mindset really transforms the United States on the international stage. Without such federal unity, how would the nation react to an inevitable world war, if one ever happens at all? Things get murky 20 years on from an event that in this timeline didn't happen. The war basically set the stage for Republicans in office for 40 years. From the 1860s to 1914, there had only been 2 Democrat presidents. counting the 2 terms of Grover Cleveland and Woodrow Wilson. So let's...
And Woodrow Wilson only got elected because the Republicans split the vote between William Howard Taft and former President Theodore Roosevelt, who runs on a third-party ticket when he doesn't get the Republican nomination. So you don't even get Wilson in the 1912 election without that. Yeah, that's a good point. I think Manifest Destiny is still a thing, and that could become a uniting force for North and South, because they're still going to have that Manifest Destiny idea about expanding west all the way to the Pacific, and do it in a united way. So I still think the whole empire thing, I don't know that it changes that as much as some might think, but interesting to think about.
That's a bit of change politically. Speaking of Woodrow Wilson, like I said, such a change happens to American politics, I doubt we'd ever see Wilson become president. And with that, oh boy, a lot changes. That might be a video in itself. But just imagine a United States that is less of an interventionist power for the sake of protecting democracy. This doctrine is called Wilsonianism for a reason. Wilson was the one who first started using intervention as an excuse to replace European colonialism with American democracy. More like puppet governments that served US interests. We'd probably see a US more involved in its own affairs and less prone to being a world power.
Yeah, that said though, remember, we've got the Monroe Doctrine going all the way back to the 5th president of the United States, where he wanted to protect nations that were being born in the Americas from intervention, because Monroe's president, right when you start to see revolutions breaking out, like the Simon Bolivar stuff down in South America, and he instituted the Monroe Doctrine, which is basically Europe, you stay in your hemisphere and we'll stay in ours, and you don't bother with what's happening here. So I think that was already something that was the case.
But that's just a shot in the dark. The cotton gin was not a very complex invention, and I doubt that even if Eli Whitney didn't invent it, that it simply wouldn't have been invented at some point. This entire scenario is based on the idea that this one thing doesn't get invented, yet it easily could have still happened because of the demand of cotton. The gin was invented and used for a reason, and it was to make cotton usable and profitable on a mass scale. It was the fuel for a rapidly industrializing world and laid the groundwork for an economy based around factories and wage labor rather than working at home. These factories brought people into the cities and created the modern world.
Yeah.
Textiles were at the forefront of all of that, and that wouldn't have happened in Britain and the North without Southern cotton.
And that's true to a point. A lot of, even in Britain, in places like Birmingham, where you had the Industrial Revolution really taking hold, a lot of that was centered around textiles, but a ton of it was iron and steel as well, and the industries that popped up to support that, like coal. So I don't know how much that would have really impacted the Industrial Revolution, because so much of it was in other industries besides textiles.
So take in the entire scenario you've seen and imagine if somehow this invention still didn't happen, however unlikely that'd be. Then the most vital resource to Britain's textile factories, ground zero of the entire Industrial Revolution, doesn't happen either. With this alternate timeline, without the gin, slavery dies off naturally, but also so does the spark that led to the West's rapid rise in industry and modernization. The antebellum South is often seen as something isolated from the progress of the rest of the world, stuck in a time of agriculture while the North built factories, but it was actually just the first part in a massive machine.
I agree with him that the antebellum South should be seen as having a big important role in the industrialization of the rest of the world. The only thing I think in this whole video that I probably don't agree 100% with him about is the idea that textiles were essential to the growth of the Industrial Revolution. Like I said a minute ago, a lot of other things going on just besides textiles.
The plantation owners were the oil barons of their time, and their power came from selling their slave-picked cotton to places around the world which saw the practice as abhorrent, yet at the same time profited and improved their own societies from it. If you want to make some connections with today, diamonds are shiny and expensive, but are often mined by slave labor in Africa from warlords. We have cheap clothes and products today, but only because of labor paid practically nothing in China or third world nations. We fund and prop up horrendous regimes simply because they give us the resources we want. I'm not saying Chinese factory workers face the same conditions that literal slaves did back.
No, but he makes a good point that there are some parallels to be made today.
Back in the South. What I'm saying is that people often have this disconnect with the origins of the products they enjoy. The North saw slavery as horrendous, but at the same time kept those that supported it in power by buying their cotton. They seem to have this idea that once cotton was out of the South, it was somehow clean, but of course, it wasn't. It was still picked by slaves. So what we're left with is a world where an abhorrent practice ends very soon, but at the same time, industrialization is delayed, or perhaps doesn't happen to the extent that it did. Society going into the 1900s resembles how it did a century prior. More agriculture, smaller industry, and less technological improvement. The US without bloodshed doesn't become a more centralized nation, and is even more divided between states and regions. This invention, and the entire war itself, really created the modern US, and in part, the modern world might not exist at all. In a way, this invention caused such pain and suffering for Americans of all races in slavery or war, it ended up leading to this, our modernized, connected world, all because cotton makes very nice shirts. Certainly something to ponder. This is Cody of Alternate History Hub.
So we've talked before in some of our other videos about how every world event is connected, about how you can take things like the 7 Years' War and see how it leads into the American Revolution, and how the American Revolution leads to the French Revolution, which leads to the Napoleonic Wars, which leads to the unification of Germany, which leads to World War I, which leads to World War II, which leads to the Cold War, and there's a lot of other stuff in between. And of course, the American Civil War would be another one of those things. If that doesn't happen, that's going to have a ripple effect on things that happen around the world. That's not to say that the U.S. is the center of the universe and that it would completely change the rest of the world, but it certainly would, just as major changes in any major country would have changed the world. So a lot to think about there, and I agree with almost everything he said. I think that was really well done, and of the alternate history stuff that I've looked at, one of the better ones. So I would love to hear your thoughts, though. What do you think they got right, they got wrong? How do you think it would have been different? Use the comment section below. If there's other stuff you'd like me to take a look at from Alternate History Hub, let me know in the description. Hit that like button, make sure you turn on the notifications, and check out my visit to Hollywood Cemetery later today. Thanks for watching.